Hello and welcome back to PHIL-1009, Ethics and Society at Fanshawe College in summer of 2020. I apologize, it's Friday afternoon. This video is very late. I lost internet at my house for the better part of 2-3 days, starting on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The Rogers truck came and they replaced the power supply and the junction box. It was a whole thing. I just did not have reliable internet access until yesterday afternoon. So I've been playing catch up ever since. I'll be trying again to get these out earlier in the week moving forward. I'm sorry, it was outside of my control. But now the internet is back. Things are looking good. A few announcements before we get into the topic for this week. First of all, in terms of what's due for the class, there's a quiz that will be opening here soon, May 29th. Quiz number 1 is due May 29th. I think it's going to open the 25th. So keep an eye for that. Also, June 7th, short essay number 1. The instructions are there. Just click on the link. It'll take you to the instructions. If you have any questions or concerns, you can't find the instructions, you can't find the quizzes, oh, navigating FOL is complicated, just send me an email. No problem at all, and I'll be glad to help you. Another thing I want to talk about is the textbook. Technically, the textbook associated with this class is a book called The Elements of Moral Philosophy by James and Stuart Rachels. I hear that it's unavailable. It's very expensive on Amazon, and I do want to say you don't need it for the class. All right, the slides should be enough to get by. When you write your essays, do a little bit of research and find outside sources that bear on the issues you're discussing in the essays. Otherwise, you should be fine. You don't need to go off and buy it to succeed. However, if you have bought it already, if you've spent money on it, just use it in your essays, and that'll count as your research component. So hopefully that's all right. I've made a few announcements about these things here. All right, so I hope everyone is doing great out there. You're staying safe. Right now, we are going to talk about the Week 3 module, which is, let's start up here, ethical egoism and the issue of world poverty. Basically, what we're going to be doing is discussing the idea of egoism and ethics, and then using a case study of world poverty as a way of kind of hashing out some moral issues that have to do with our responsibility to others, if there is such a thing. Last week we talked about the kind of the nature of morality in a few different senses. We talked about first of all the problem of relativism. Some of us are kind of attracted to the idea that there's some relativism in ethics, there's some relativism in morality. Some things are bound to culture, but profound and total relativism is paradoxical. It's self-undermining. But even if relativism is false, we can still ask ourselves, what is morality? What would motivate us to be moral? And we looked at a few different theories very quickly. We looked at Plato's idea of justice as a communal notion, because the well-being of our community is our well-being. Divine command theory claims morality is to obey God's commands. We also talked about Hobbes' social contract theory. We enter into a social contract to escape the state of nature because it is in our self-interest to agree to some rules. In this, for Hobbes, you can think of morality almost as a technology we've created. David Hume thinks morality is grounded in empathy, ultimately. Morality is a function of ethics. Morality is a function, of course, it's a function of ethics. It's a function of emotions, fundamentally. And utilitarians ground ethics in a claim about psychology. We avoid pain, we seek pleasure, and everyone's the same in this respect. We will be circling back and talking a lot about Hobbes, about utilitarians, about various ethical theories later in the semester, but this was kind of just a quick and dirty introduction to some ethical theories. Evaluations, I mentioned the first quiz coming up, May 25, 29. Another one in June, week 9, week 13. So just keep an eye on that evaluation schedule. I'm sure you guys have lots of classes right now, lots of things coming at the same time. So, mark your calendars and prepare in advance for these things. And if you have any questions, let me know. Okay, so this week, we are talking about ethical egoism and altruism. What does egoism mean? Egoism means roughly that uh, we are working towards our self-interest first. Altruism means we should be selfless in the sense that we should sacrifice our own interests for the sake of other people. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about these two views. Is morality necessarily something that involves altruism? When we say ethical egoism, is that a contradiction in terms? Or do we have a duty to be egoistic? Some people have thought so. But first of all, let me separate out two concepts, two distinct um, kind of like ways of approaching the issue of egoism. And it has to kind of do with a descriptive versus normative view here. What I mean by that is the descriptive view is describing something about reality, and the normative view is prescribing something. In other words, it's saying about it's something we ought to do. So psychological egoism is a descriptive claim. It could be true or false, but what it says is um, it is in the nature of human beings to be selfish. So that's a psychological view. We just are selfish creatures. We always act in our own best interests. Ethical egoism is the view, is a normative view. It says we ought to act in our own self-interest. So there's a psychological theory that says this is what people are like, and maybe we can change human nature, maybe we can't. But that's a descriptive claim. I'm not passing judgment on it. Ethical egoism is the claim that we are egoists and that's a good thing. That's what we ought to be. And if, you know what, even if we weren't egoists, we should be. It's not just all right to be egotistical, it's what we should be doing. And again, if it wasn't our nature to be ethical egoists, we should still change ourselves to do the right thing, which is to be ethical egoists, according to this view. Now, ethical egoism has not actually been a very popular ethical theory over the years. Some people have defended it, and we're going to be looking at that. But most people have criticized ethical egoism, criticized the view that we ought to act only in our best interests. We should only seek our own interests. We should only be egotistical. We should be selfish, not selfless. Most people have criticized this. Um, so, in one way to think about it is think about our duties to other people. Ethical egoism says no to the question, right? Do we have responsibilities to other people simply because they are people who could be helped or harmed by what we do? Egoism says no, we don't have responsibilities to anyone but ourselves, right? And the answer no to that question here is the answer to the ethical normative question. Ethical egoism answers no, we do not have ethical responsibilities to other people. Psychological egoism is the view that we just kind of say no by our actions. This is what we are, right? So again, psychological egoism is a claim about human psychology. Ethical egoism is a claim about morality, about how things ought to be, how we ought to act. Sometimes people run these two claims together, in the sense that if you make an argument that it is human nature to be egotistical, to be selfish, that shows that ethical egoism is justified because it's human nature. I don't like these sorts of arguments myself. So let me give you a couple of reasons why we should maybe be skeptical about the descriptive claim of psychological egoism justifying the ethical claim of ethical egoism. One reason is the reason Hume gave us, which is you can't derive an ought from an is. This argument here suggests that every normative claim is supported by an argument which has a normative premise. Factual claims by themselves don't prove ethical claims, right? No sets of facts can prove an ethical thing, says Hume. I think we talked about that last week. Furthermore, the appeal to human nature might commit something we call the naturalistic fallacy, that just because something is natural, it's good. Well, that's not necessarily true. Natural things aren't justified morally just in virtue of their being natural. We don't think. So, but even if Actually, let me say one more thing actually though here. So if we were psychological egoists, would that show ethical egoism to be true? Well, Hume says you can't get an ought from an is. Facts don't give you moral conclusions. If you do believe facts give you moral conclusions, you're kind of committing the naturalistic fallacy, which is to identify whatever is natural with what's good, but that's probably not true. Lots of natural things are pretty bad. And third, claims that are really deeply based in human nature are kind of wedded to the idea that there's such a thing as human nature that is rigid, unchangeable, untrainable, not plastic, not malleable, and that's probably not empirically true, right? It's probably not the case that our natures are so deep as to be unchangeable. It probably isn't even the case that we have a nature. If anything, our nature is to be nurtured. So if you think about the nature versus nurture dichotomy, we have a nature to be nurtured, to have a culture, to have um, a capacity to adapt to circumstances in a really wide variety of ways. That's another problem I have with moving from the descriptive claim of psychological egoism to justifying the ethical claim of ethical egoism. Um, and in any event, many of us are not descriptively egoists. We act on a selfless sense of moral obligation, at least some of the time. Um, and even if we always did act on the basis of what we personally desired, this doesn't mean we're being selfish, because it depends on what it is we desire to do. Right? Maybe I want to help others. Feeling good about helping others is a side effect, but it's not my primary motivation. So some people say, well, we only act good because it makes us feel good to act good, so it's really fundamentally selfish. But I think that's much too simplistic an account of motivation. In any event, it's an empirical account, which would require, in other words, more sophisticated scientific evidence to show that we actually only ever act on self-interest. I just don't see that being supported by the evidence. Um, so, as I said, yeah, human nature is plastic. I've already talked about that. I sometimes get ahead of myself and I think of the future slides. So moving from a discussion of the descriptive claim of psychological egoism, this is human nature, if there is such a thing as human nature, ethical egoism is the view that no matter what our nature is, even if there's no such thing as human nature, morally speaking, we should pursue our self-interest. A good moral philosophy should tell us what we ought to do, and what we ought to do is be selfish. Self-interest accounts for all our moral obligations. What's interesting here is that the outcome of ethical egoism could be a lot of things. For example, social contract theory of the Hobbesian variety, which we talked about last week, we're going to talk about again later, was actually kind of based on psychological egoism. It is in our self-interest to agree to the social contract, to agree to cooperate. It's in our self-interest to kind of limit what we're able to do to each other, to follow some rules that are strictly enforced. Which is interesting, because it's not the same. Not everybody draws this conclusion from ethical egoism, as we're going to see. But Hobbes really, sorry, not from psychological egoism. So ethical egoism says, morally speaking, you should do what benefits you, and that's the right thing to do. Sometimes you're going to see an argument like this for ethical egoism. Why should we benefit ourselves first? Because if we look after ourselves, society as a whole is better off, is the argument. And that's not actually a bad argument, right? Why should we look out for our self-interest? Well, because if we do so, society as a whole is better off. It's not a bad argument, but one of the interesting things here is that it's not actually an argument for ethical egoism, because we are not actually arguing for the thesis that morality is self-interest, that morality is to be an egoist. We're actually arguing for a different theory. We're arguing that society as a whole is better off is the ultimate ethical end. Because if morality was just self-interest, why should we care that society is better off? Right? That would make everyone's interests the object of moral behavior. So we care about is everyone's interests, and the way to serve everyone's interest is paradoxically maybe to be self-interested, to be ethical, right? The way to serve the common good is to be an egoist. But then this is not an argument for ethical egoism. It's an argument for whatever's in the best interests of society. And ethical egoism is the means to that end. But if the means didn't serve that ends, we wouldn't be egoists anymore, right? A good argument for ethical egoism would have egoism as the ends and not the means. That the outcome in a way wouldn't matter because ethical egoism would just be the right thing, no matter whether or not society as a whole is better off or not. So this argument here is a little bit paradoxical. I said it's a good argument in the sense that if it were true, maybe we should be ethical egoists. But it's a bad argument for ethical egoism because it's actually an argument for the view that we should consider collective outcomes, everyone's interests, because society as a whole is better off through the means of self-interest. So if we want an argument for ethical egoism that kind of justifies ethical egoism itself, not as a means to an end, right, but just ethical egoism is good, we might think of someone like Ayn Rand, a kind of a famous American libertarian thinker, wrote a number of books, Atlas Shrugged, most famously, The Fountainhead, right, some other books. And her argument is kind of an argument against altruism. And if you defeat altruism, Rand kind of seems to think the fallback position is ethical egoism. That's what you have left because it's kind of it's one or the other, and it can't be one, so it has to be the other. And Rand says that altruism denies the value of the individual person. So the argument, I don't think it's a great argument, but I mean, you could write about this in your essay. If you disagree with me, that's fine. I don't grade on the basis of your agreement with me. I grade it if it's an interesting, thoughtful essay. You get an A. So Rand says, look, we can be egoists or altruists. To be altruistic is to sacrifice yourself for others. And if you're sacrificing yourself, what you're really doing is denying an individual right to exist. But each man must live as an end in himself and follow his own rational self-interest. Altruism says, quote, again Rand, man has no right to exist for his own sake. That service to others is the only justification of his existence. So obviously it's a little bit black and white, like it's either one or the other. And if you ever sacrifice yourself, you're basically saying you don't have a right to exist. Nevertheless, we can kind of see the line of thought here, right, that an ethics solely based on altruism would deny the value of the individual person. Does this force us to become ethical egoists? I think the conclusion doesn't go far enough, but Rand does have a point that an overfocus on altruism is in conflict with the idea, right, that people are ends in themselves. So that's not a bad point. I think her conclusion takes it a little bit too far because of her really kind of like dichotomous black and white. You're either a full egoist or a full altruist exclusively. That seems to be a mischaracterization of this possibility space of ethics. So few have adopted this view, right, that all moral actions have to be altruistic. Hardly anyone has ever said self-regard is immoral, right? That's much too strong. So I think Rand is kind of attacking a straw man here. Naturalistic. I've already talked about the naturalistic fallacy. So let's move on from here. Here's another problem one could press to ethical egoism. Does ethical egoism approve of behavior we'd want to say under ordinary circumstances is immoral, like theft, murder, assault? As long as it benefits the perpetrator, it seems that ethical egoism would approve, right? So if you steal candy from a baby but you're enjoying it, then it's okay for this person to have done it because they should just be ethical egoists. So what would we say here? The ethical egoist could just push back and say, look, if it benefits the person doing it, it's not immoral by definition. So when you're asking, does ethical egoism approve of immoral behavior? Well, morality is defined by what benefits you. So, of course, it doesn't. In fact, you're calling things immoral, but why? Right? So it's kind of a loaded question. So they can just kind of reject the premise of the question here. Um, or you can also say, maybe perhaps more reasonably, it is not actually in your self-interest to murder someone because of the consequences of that act to you. Right? Because if you murder someone, probably people get mad and try and murder you back, or at least put you in jail, and that's not actually in your self-interest. Right? It's kind of a Hobbesian social contract view. Um, we could maybe immoral acts, to take a more Platonistic communitarian view, deny the value that a society brings to us, which is all right too. Some libertarians also argue back that, right, an act like murder, even if it brings, right, if it benefits you, doesn't make it okay because then you're denying someone else's right to exist. And they believe in something called the non-aggression principle. Then you're not supposed to initiate force against other people, right? Because my right to punch ends at the limits of your nose, kind of view. Um, but again, I find these views sometimes hard to defend because if we're going to be strict ethical egoists, I can't really see the justification for believing other people have rights. I could see why I should have. I could see why things that benefit me should be done, but I don't see why other people should have rights. Because a right is a collective notion, so we're not actually egoists. Um, and in fact, because of this problem, I think one criticism is that ethical egoism can in fact kind of breed conflict, right? It's in every individual's self-interest to lay claim to resources, especially if they're scarce. And you can argue from the point of view of pure ethical egoism, without like a background commitment to natural rights, right, that it would be morally justified for the strongest, most well-armed to possess that scarce resource and prevent others from using it. Right? So if there's like only enough water for my crops but not yours, we're going to fight over it, and because it's both in our self-interest to use the water to water our fields. Um, and we're both going to be right to fight it out. So the idea of ethical egoism plus rights is not actually ethical egoism in a strict sense because rights are intrinsically a non-egoistic idea. Because to respect your rights means to put aside my egoism. So pure ethical egoism, right, does not actually resolve any moral problems. It really just encourages each person to fight it out. Unless you have this kind of social contract view where we agree it's in our self-interest to limit the things we are allowed to do. Oh, here's a nice little comic. You can read it. It's about ethical egoism. So, uh, while we're talking about ethical egoism, how am I doing for time here? Let me just look at my clock. I've been live for 23 minutes. So, when it comes to ethical egoism, um, another way to think about it is as a form of moral discrimination, as a impermissible kind of moral discrimination. Most of us believe, and this is kind of a bedrock belief, that it's wrong to treat others differently by dividing them into kind of arbitrary groups, right? That it is wrong to discriminate on the basis of race, sex, or religion, etc., right? That if we say that a minority group has fewer rights, right, they can't vote or own property, we think of that as morally wrong. And this is an old Enlightenment era idea, right? That we all have equal rights, we have a right to equal treatment. And in a way, this conflicts with ethical egoism, which says that the interests of some groups count more. Which group? The group of ourself. But why is oneself more important? Isn't that a form of ethical discrimination? As Rachel says, ethical egoism is arbitrary because it can't answer the question, what is the difference between myself and others that justifies placing myself in a special moral category? In other words, to be an ethical egoist is to engage in a certain kind of ethical discrimination. Now, some of you might be thinking that this argument can't possibly, right, because the idea of racial discrimination being wrong is clearly different than the idea of self-discrimination or other discrimination being wrong, because there's a difference between treating people in terms of a group category and then treating oneself as different than everyone else. That seems to be different kinds of discrimination. And I think that I don't really like Rachel's argument here because I think that criticism of Rachel's is probably correct. It's not ethical egoism is not the same thing as discrimination, um, especially because of what's implied here. However, right, there is kind of an underlying point. If you just read the Calvin Hobbes comic, right, where Calvin is saying, so Calvin is a little boy, Hobbes here, Hobbes, that's actually named after Thomas Hobbes. Um, Calvin says it's a dog-eat-dog world, so I'll do whatever I have to and let others argue about whether it's right or not. And he pushes Calvin. Why'd you do that? Why'd you push me in the mud? You're in my way. No, you're not. The ends justify the means. I didn't mean for everyone, you dolt, just me. Right, so the ethical egoism, right, would naturally lead to this sort of conflict if we. So there's one way of maybe thinking about how to resolve that conflict is through the lens of discrimination in the sense that if you put yourself in a special category, right, you will lead to this kind of bad possible outcome. And discrimination is one way to think about how you might cease treating yourself as a special moral category. Just a thought here, although I'm not a huge fan of Rachel's argument here. So I know that lots of things to think about here, obviously, right? Psychological versus ethical egoism, Rand's views, criticisms of Rand's views, right? There's lots of content here, so you might want to go back and reread the slides and think about all the different concepts here. So the argument against ethical egoism here is that we should treat all people the same way and treat everyone's interests as equally important because there's going to be no relevant moral difference between us and other people. Morality recognizes the needs of others and has to do this. That's where ethical egoism kind of fails, Rachel says. Sometimes I hear a weird term. I've only heard this on the internet. I've never read it in the philosophical literature. Something called equality of outcomes. I don't think anyone's ever argued for perfect equality of outcome. I don't think even Marx argued for equality of outcome. I'd have to brush up on my Marx. I've never really was a scholar of this guy. Not a big fan. But if I recall correctly, in Critique of the Gotha program, where Marx critiques like a rival Democrat socialist wing, even Marx doesn't go for equality of outcome. So nobody argues for equality of outcome. I think it really the rejection of equality of ethical egoism implies an equality of treatment, right? Not necessarily an equality of outcome, which is a weird snare word I've only encountered on online debates, and we should probably just ignore. So let me very briefly pivot to a kind of a case study here that I want to talk about, which has to do with duties to the poor. So Peter Singer is a pretty, for a philosopher, famous. He's a philosopher of what we call applied ethics. And applied ethics is when you take kind of an abstract moral theory, then you apply it to some really concrete ethical problem. So Singer is an applied ethicist in the sense that he practices what he preaches, first of all, and he preaches very specific things. So Singer argues that if you're affluent, if you're rich, you should not spend money on luxuries while other people are starving, because our luxuries are not as important as other people's survival. In other words, it's a pretty, which is exactly the opposite of ethical egoism. Now, why should we think this? In the Rachel's book, they talk a little bit about this case of a guy called Zell Kravinsky, a self-made millionaire, and he donated most of his wealth, $45 million to charity. He even gave his kidney to a complete stranger. The chances of dying as a result of a kidney transplant has been 1 in 4,000. And Kravinsky believed that, under the circumstances, to withhold a kidney from someone who would otherwise die means valuing your own life at 4,000 times that of a stranger, a ratio he termed obscene. He said that's obscene. My life is not worth 4,000 other people's lives. So, therefore, ethical egoism has to be wrong. This is probably not the best case study because, I don't think we have a moral obligation to donate our kidneys. However, there's kind of an underlying principle here, which is To what extent are we willing to say that the things we have and don't need are more important than the things people don't have and need? And we should also think of this in terms of something we call moral luck. And the fact is, we are thrust into circumstances under which we've had not full control. And moral luck kind of occurs when we apply moral concepts. We assign blame or praise for an action or consequences, right? As I think this is the Stanford Encyclopedia link. No, it's Wikipedia. Even when it's clear the agent did not have full control over the actions or its consequences. So, in other words, there's going to be people who are just going to be born in the wrong place at the wrong time, and as a result are going to live a life of deprivation and starvation. Now, you can't control the circumstances of your birth. And even after you're born, it doesn't necessarily mean you'll be able to control your circumstances once you're an adult. You might just be living through a civil war. You might be living in a part of the world where, desertification is making like a certain, agriculture really hard. And all kinds of circumstances outside of your control. So luck should not be part of moral evaluation. Someone born into certain kinds of poverty is not fully responsible for their circumstance. So when we're thinking about moral luck and we're thinking about what we have, we are lucky to be born, like if I myself was lucky enough to be born of, stable, middle-class, affluent parents in a prosperous, stable nation. That's just luck. And other people were less lucky. So do I deserve the things I have? Ish. Do other people deserve to starve? Not really. That's just luck. So don't we have a moral duty, given that we should treat everyone's interests equally, to rectify this imbalance? At least that's what Singer says. Right? Singer is, in the background of his theory, he's a utilitarian. Now, utilitarianism, right, there's reasons I bring up these things, is a view that we should, right, that because human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain, what we should do is maximize utility in the sense of making sure people are able to avoid pain and get pleasure. By pleasure, they don't mean just like sensory pleasure. They mean like having the basic things you need to survive and thrive and be well. So for Singer, spending money on non-necessities while unlucky people fail to have basic needs is a serious moral failure. Right? I was lucky enough to be born in a prosperous place. Other people were unlucky and born in a poor place. The things I have, I don't deserve the things I have, and they don't deserve the things they don't have. So to rectify this moral imbalance means to, right, just give some stuff away. Or again, for the utilitarian, we call this utility, in the sense it's kind of a technical term, which basically means like the degree of your needs being satisfied. And the utility gained by luxury goods is less than the utility of basic needs for millions of people. So if you think of like a very expensive gold-plated car, the happiness I get out of the car is going to be less than the happiness and satisfaction a million people can get from like not going to bed hungry. So there's something, Singer says, morally obscene about a gold-plated luxury car. So for a utilitarian like Singer, luxury spending is morally atrocious. And again, I'm curious what you think of this argument, right? So we live on a planet where millions of people die of easily preventable diseases, but trillions of dollars are spent on non-essential luxury items. Sometimes on attempts to save lives from extremely remote threats. And it's really interesting because luxury spending and money past a certain threshold is not really strongly correlated to life satisfaction and happiness anyway. The fact is, above about $70,000 in North America, $70,000, $80,000 a year, your happiness is not really raised by every subsequent dollar you make. We seem to have like a plateau-ish of happiness, that once you're making about $80K a year-ish, every dollar you make above that doesn't really contribute to your happiness anymore. I mean, it kind of does, but not as much. We call this diminishing marginal utility. Do I have a slide on diminishing marginal utility? I do. So the fact is, if you have $1 and that's all you have, your second dollar doubles your wealth, right? But if you have $1,000, then you add another dollar. You didn't double your wealth, right? You added like 1/1000th, and so on and so forth, right? So the value of each individual unit of money, the value of money goes down the more money you have, and goes up the less money you have, right? If I'm a billionaire and I see a dollar on the sidewalk, I'm not even going to bother. All right, but if I'm homeless and I find the dollar, that could actually change the whole course of my day. So diminishing marginal utility is an economic term that means the value of each individual unit of money, the value goes down the more I have, and the value goes up the less I have. And we have a moral duty to recognize this, to recognize that spending $1 million on a luxury car is going to give me such a small amount of utility, right? But that $1 million spent on like basic necessities is going to give a lot of people a tremendous amount of utility, right? And that imbalance is a moral problem for Singer. So the affluent, Singer argues, have a moral responsibility, which at the extreme there is to help others to the point at which you would harm yourself more than the person you're trying to help if you gave more. And that's a very demanding ethical view. But it is in part a recognition of the fact of diminishing marginal utility, right? That, again, somebody who lives on $1 a day in the third world, you give them $1, you've doubled that day's income. However, if a billionaire makes one extra dollar, they won't even notice. So not even a rounding error. Another way of thinking about it, Singer says, how am I doing for time here? Because I don't want to spend 37 minutes. Okay. I mean, consider this thought experiment, Singer says. Suppose Bob parks his uninsured, brand new luxury car by a railroad track. He's, right, so in this scenario, just one of those trolley problem situations, right? So he parks it, and there's a boy stuck on the train tracks, and he's next to a switch. So here's what's going to happen. The train's going to come and hit and kill the boy. Or he could, throw the switch, the train goes onto the unused track where his car is parked and destroys his car. And if Bob's looking at the scenario, there's a train coming, it's going to kill a kid unless he agrees that his car should be destroyed. And if he decides to let the boy die rather than let his car be destroyed, did he do something wrong? And if you say yes, right, the value of a life is more important than the value of your car, Singer's going to go, well, isn't that true when you bought the darn thing? Right? Why didn't you just, if you already agree that the value of a single life is more important than the value of your luxury car, shouldn't you just not have bought the car in the first place? Shouldn't you have bought it like the car you needed to get around, but cheaper? Like buy like a used Toyota Corolla, and the rest of the money just give it so people can eat, because you don't need this luxury car, right? So because Singer's going to say, look, it doesn't matter if you're actually in that railroad situation. It doesn't matter if you could see the child and he's 100 foot away. It doesn't matter if the child is a mile away. It doesn't matter if the child is on another continent. If Bob should save the child on the train tracks, he should save the child, right, on another continent. Bob still has a good life without his car. The child dies if he keeps his car. And there's no difference for Singer whether there's a train or a famine. We have the same duties. So, let's talk some objections. Don't some people have a higher level of moral obligation on the basis of diminishing marginal utility? Why should I give money to charity when there's even richer people? Well, yeah, no, that's that's an objection I've sometimes had in classrooms, but no, that's actually our view. People have, the more wealth you have, the higher your obligation to give some of it away, because actually, right, if you look at the very wealthiest people, they actually have a tremendous amount of wealth that they aren't getting that much utility from, and a lot of good could be done. Some people have come to this realization. Someone like Bill Gates, who had billions of dollars and is giving most of it away, has actually done an enormous amount of good in the world with eradicating malaria, for example, and other preventable diseases, right? And he's still a very comfortable human being. Right, so you can look, I have some stats about wealth inequality here. Right, Singer writes, if every citizen living in affluent nations contributed their share, we wouldn't have to make such drastic sacrifices. The government ought to increase overseas AIDS allocation that would spread the burden more equitably. So one objection would be like, look, should I give if other people don't? Like, it's great we all have duties, but nobody else is doing it. Why should I be the sucker giving away 40% of my wealth? Well, what other people do doesn't change our moral responsibility. The value of our excess affluence is always less than the value of another human survival in an unjust world. Right? Here's a picture of a man working in an open pit coal mine. Right? This dude works harder in one day that I've done in my lifetime, but he's very poor due to circumstances out of his control, right? If we can fix these circumstances, and if it means me going by without not having like a luxury good, then I should do it. And it doesn't matter what other people do, according to Spig. Isn't global poverty down anyway? So isn't just capitalism going to solve this? Another objection to Singer. Singer would argue that right, declining poverty numbers doesn't change our moral obligations for suffering here and now, right? We should, right, this is too slow. Right, we could have fixed this years ago, Singer's going to say. Right? Suppose I know trains are getting safer in general. Does this mean I can allow the child to die to save my car? It's like, well, yeah, but train safety is getting better. Well, no, you still have a responsibility here and now, Singer's going to say. All right, why do we need to sacrifice when things are going well? Because they're going well too slowly, right? Why should a 500 million people suffer right now? All right, just to summarize, psychological egoism is the view that people are selfish by nature. Does psychological egoism justify ethical egoism, the view that we should act in our own self-interests? Probably not. There are arguments for ethical egoism. We've looked at some. One objection is that there is no relevant moral differences between ourselves and other people. Well, what does it mean to take other people's interests into account? What does it mean that there are no relevant moral differences? Well, Singer says we have to give our excess wealth to people who would die without it, following the principle of diminishing marginal utility. Is this true? Well, it's something you can argue about in your papers. I'm going to sign off for now. I hope you found this lecture interesting. And if you have any questions, send me an email. All right, I'm out.